Hello, dear viewers. This is the latest episode of the Free Marketeers podcast. I am joined by Jacques Jonker and Christo Hattingh. And today we just thought we'd discuss some topical, topics in the news.
I don't think there's anything big going on.
It's just a few illnesses there and there. A few stocks are going down. Nothing major.
Yeah.
But starting with the COVID-19, which is a very big scale. It seems like everyone is reacting quite sometimes irrationally, but everyone is scared about where this is going to lead. Stock markets are crashing, and so I guess the question is like, what should we be doing as South Africans? What should the government be doing? Is there anything we can do? Can we save the economy from the effects, Chris?
I don't think we can save the South African economy from anything. So there's no way to save it, whether it's a global pandemic or the South African government itself. I think I was reading an hour ago, it was up to 24 now, 23, 24
cases in South Africa.
Okay, so every few days we're getting a few more confirmed cases. We know that the South Africans who were in Wuhan are coming back to the country. They'll be in quarantine for 14 days. I'm assuming the people in that area aren't very happy with that, but the decision has been made now. The thing with pandemics is there is an element of mass hysteria and panic. So when you see people panic buying stuff in the shops, of course you can make the argument that in 1,000 cases you might be wrong, but in the one case you might actually be right about the pandemic. You'd rather be prepared than not. So you can sort of understand why people are stockpiling things, why they're buying stuff from the stores, why they're buying out all these masks and everything else they can find. In terms of what South Africa could do, I think the focus should very much be on making sure that we have as many testing kits available as possible. Get some plasma samples and stuff from South Korea and China where the kits have been working, where they've been on the ground since the start, so we can have the exact sequencing of the disease here when we test people, instead of wasting time like they've been doing in America. They've been having problems with their kits, with their testing kits from the start, which is why they're sort of trying to catch up now behind it. In terms of more interventionary government measures, some people, will make the argument for travel bans and that sort of thing, travel restrictions. We know from the economic perspective that's going to be very bad for any economy, whether it's South Africa or the US or anything
Especially
like that.
for South Africa.
Any restrictions on trade makes any sort of economic movement, never mind economic growth, very improbable. But then again, you need to decide what the role of the state should be in terms of this sort of thing. Should they impose that sort of thing? Should they try and educate people? I think there's different angles of approaching the problem.
Okay. No, I think we should definitely go a little bit deeper into the economic impacts of this pandemic. Jack, maybe you could start us off, but then I think afterwards we would want to go back into this issue of the travel ban because I think it's an interesting one. And so what do you think about that, Jack? Like, you maybe just sketch out the economic impacts, how they've played out over the past few weeks and months, and what's expected to happen.
Basically, seeing a slowdown of economic activity, slowdown in production. I mean, let's, for instance, when quarantining Wuhan is one of the tech centers of China and also one of the most important tech centers in the world. So that slows down technological advancement, even though it might be slightly, but it has a ripple effect over the global economy. And then we also get back to travel bans. If you restrict the movement of people as well as goods and services, you restrict by extension the movement of goods and services a lot. I mean, think for a basic example, imagine hypothetically they quarantine Joburg.
Right.
And there are a ton of companies in Joburg who need to move their products out to South Africa to customers. They can't do that anymore. So you're basically seeing a big slowdown in the economy. This will only worsen now. Our current economic woes are already very bad. So basically, we're just going to see a worsening of that. Our economy, I predict, will not grow this year. It will most likely contract unless they get a vaccine for this virus, a cure, hopefully pretty soon. But I'm looking at some data here. So the Dow Jones Industrial Average, this has been the sharpest decline since 1987. And that was what was known as Black Monday. I mean, even the decline when the 2008-9 financial crisis occurred wasn't as steep as this one.
Really? Jeez.
Yes, we've got from yesterday's close up until today a decrease of 10% on the Dow Jones Industrial Average. The JSE is busy tanking. We've already basically what you're seeing is we've already predicted there's a stock bubble occurring globally. None of us predicted that a virus would pop that bubble.
Right.
But I do think maybe the virus is causing the bubble not only to pop, but then after the bubble has popped, a further decline is coming about. So now the logical argument that people are making is that, okay, well, restrict travel bans, implement travel bans, restrict travel to contain the virus. But the problem with that is you need to balance that with the economic impacts there are. Because at the end of the day, you need resources in order to fight these things. And to generate resources and stuff, you need to generate the wealth required to use those resources. You need economic activity to continue. You can't just simply shut down the entire world and expect to be able to fight this.
No,
So it's a very complicated situation.
That's a good point, because I don't think when the Chinese decided to shut down Wuhan and the Hubei province, they really did a proper cost-benefit analysis, looking at the cost versus the people who would be saved by this measure. And so I think this is something that everyone needs to do. But I guess when people are scared, it's a tough one, and you're a politician,
of course,
and you look at, okay, your constituents are some of them are going to get sick, some of them are going to die, and these people are going to be scared. So I think the incentives on politicians can be impossible in times like this, because they need to please their constituents to stay in power. So they will end up doing stupid things like shutting down entire cities.
I think if you see voluntary moves by associations like in Europe with the soccer associations, today the Premier League, they said they'll postpone games until the 3rd of April. Italy's obviously postponed it a few weeks ago until the 3rd of April. If you see organizations doing that, then governments, I think there'll be less of the sort of push, this pressure on their shoulders. They'll see that civil society is already doing this voluntarily. I mean, obviously, from our perspective, we say government shouldn't dictate this sort of stuff in any case. But I think civil society can play into their own benefit as well by making these sorts of announcements. Obviously, they discuss it with their stakeholders, their shareholders, and then government won't have to enact these strict measures.
But what if the data actually shows that these strict measures actually work? They slow down the illness. I suppose, assuming that the economic cost is not outweighed by those measures. Right. So, the economic cost is lower than the economic cost of the measures is lower than the lost productivity.
Yes.
And so that it's a tough one. So what would you say about that, Jacques? If someone makes the case to you that, okay, it doesn't cost too much to implement these measures, and it saves a whole lot of people, would it still be justified, even though we know it's a violation of liberty?
Okay, so you have to get down to the crux of the matter here, which is ethics, and it's ethics of duty and principle, deontological ethics versus consequentialist ethics. That's what it boils down to. So from a pure consequentialist perspective, and focusing on the utility that it will provide to do it, it makes sense. But then again, you will inevitably limit the freedom of innocent people in the process. I do not have a simple answer to this dilemma. I mean, even from a monarchist perspective, one can argue that in cases like these, government should intervene and implement travel bans, but there's no time to do cost-benefit analyses in order to implement these things, which renders them inherently contrary to the rule of law, which is enshrined in our constitution. Basically, just to say, okay, so listen, we're just going to implement this travel ban on a whim. No study done, because there simply isn't time. So I honestly don't have a simple answer to this question. I mean, you will impair liberty, but the consequences of not doing so might be even worse. I simply do not have a simple answer to this. Chris, you mentioned something about South Korea, who didn't implement certain bans, and the rate of infection is either slowing there or something.
So we've read two different sources on this. So from what I've read, my perspective is that they took a softer approach. It's still authoritarian to a large extent. There is like surveillance and stuff, and they're screening people and that sort of thing. But they've taken a sort of softer approach and then combined it with their technological advantage. So there's stuff like drive-through testing stations, where you get your results within 10 minutes kind of thing. There's a smartphone app that you can use to self-diagnose. Of course, it's not going to be 100% all the time, that sort of thing. And there, in the last week, I think from Friday until Sunday, it was 500 per day, and now it's been dropping, I think, to 400, then 300, then 280 or something like that. So that's that line of argumentation, that if you have the right sort of structures in place, educate people, let them pursue the freedom route, they'll do that on their own. Of course, then you run into the other side of it. if in your country people aren't highly educated, for example, or they have a strong culture of, I don't know, government distrust and civil resistance, they're going to say, whatever you tell us, you advise us, we think it's a conspiracy theory, so we won't do that. So, again, that difficult weighing it up.
It's a tough one, and I think there's no, like, so many things, like you always have to balance. Like in the real world, ideology is useful because it sort of gives you a a guidepost of where you should go and all of that. But when it comes to some of these things, it gets difficult because at the end of the day, no one is going to subscribe to an ideology that gets them killed.
No.
Yes, and there's a couple of interesting facts about the virus. So I was also mistaken about this. It is not the same as the normal influenza virus. It's got a much higher mortality rate, but this mortality rate also differs amongst age groups. So our age group has a mortality rate of something like 0.3% along those lines. Whereas people over 80 have an average mortality rate of 14%. I mean, it's easy to say also that the mortality rate is 3%, therefore it's not that big. But in statistics, you deal with standard deviations from that numerical mean. I mean, the data is not, the mortality rate is not evenly distributed amongst all age groups. And I mean, you can even have a young person, 25 years old, but they have HIV/AIDS. So they are immunocompromised. So their mortality rate will be much higher than the average numerical mean for their age group. And an interesting point that somebody made on social media yesterday is, if you have a virus that infects its host and kills the host within like a couple of days, the virus actually spreads less than when it infects the host. The host only realizes like after a couple of days they have the virus. They move around, they interact with people, and they don't even necessarily die. Then you have a much wider spread of the virus. That is why the coronavirus is actually spreading so much. Because you don't necessarily realize this. And
you might be asymptomatic.
Just on that mortality rate, I read a news article where a health professional estimated it might actually be lower than the 3 or 3.5% estimated, because there are so many cases where people don't get diagnosed because it feels like the flu and it's a very, very mild case. So the mortality rate may be even lower. But the corollary to that is that it's even more widespread than we know. That is also another problem.
Now, it's definitely something that everyone needs to consider. I'll continue doing this research for myself, but unfortunately, we do have to move on and talk about a more cheerful topic, I guess, the crash of global stock markets. It is the impetus for this was COVID-19, so this was the thing that launched it and started it. But a bunch of us believe that it's not just COVID-19. Jacques did mention earlier that you have a lot of bubbles that have been due to pop for decades now. I mean, bonds, US government bonds have been in a bull market for 40 years, since the 1980s. So something has to give. Like when you have rates at zero now, and you can't have interest rates below zero. Well, people are trying to do it, but you really can't. No one.
It's a dumb policy.
Governments keep trying to mess with economic reality.
Exactly. So maybe we can talk about the sort of just like the way that bubbles are created by governments, how central banking enables these bubbles, and how they have to pop eventually. Like it can't be Christmas forever.
Yeah, and I mean, I've got a news report here saying that it's officially entered the Dow Jones has entered bear market territory. Okay, so just the terminology is actually quite entertaining. So you've got a bull market versus the bear market. Outside of Wall Street, you've got this raging bull. So the reason they call it the bull versus the bear market is when a bull fights with its horns, it lifts its horns up when it fights and tries to penetrate you with his horns, and that's a bull market. The market is rising upwards. What a bear does is it stands up and then it comes down on you with its paws. So that's a bear market. The stocks are going down. But when a market enters a bear market, then it's actually quite a good time to buy stocks because a rebound is imminent. Although the coronavirus brings a lot of uncertainty, but I've got an article in front of me that say there are certain market titans on the Dow Jones who are signaling rebounds. Companies like Walt Disney actually announced it's closing Disneyland, but the fact that these companies are signaling a rebound means, okay, so we're deep into bear market territory. The odds of the stock prices going even lower is actually small unless the coronavirus, the exponential growth infection rate jumps up a lot. But this should not take away from the overall picture that the stock market has declined considerably. I mean, when in a bear market, there's a signal that it might pick up again, but that's not certain, especially with the uncertainty of the infection rates and the mortality rates of the coronavirus.
And I think the sort of people are expecting it to pick up again, and that's the worrying thing for me, because it has fallen so much. People are expecting to pick up again, for it to pick up again. What if it doesn't? Because usually a standard bear market takes about 18 months for it to go to its trough, like from peak to trough. It takes about 18 months. But in 2008, between 2007 and 2000, it took 24 months between 2007 and 2009. And then during the Great Depression in the USA, it took 3 years for it to get to its trough. And then after it got to its trough, it didn't really go anywhere. And then I think it next regained the peak it had gained in 1929. It next regained it in 1959. And so those are the things you have to keep in mind, that it might be a long bear market. It might not be, a recovery might be far away from us. Like, I mean, it could be that stocks are are just unfavorable because they are risk assets. We get into a high risk environment where stocks become less favorable and they basically stay at the same level. That can happen. It can happen to any assets. And so, like, some of the signs that you've been seeing, like you've been seeing the bond markets behaving in weird ways. Like, you see yields, they first went down massively. The yields first went down massively as people were buying bonds because they wanted protection, like a low risk assets. And then all of a sudden they started going up again, and this is when the Fed came in with this $1.5 trillion package. Because if they don't control the yields on government bonds, then the American government will just go bankrupt. They have no choice.
So I was going to ask you about that. Was that the one they announced yesterday, where they're going to pump billions into the?
Yeah, so the total that they could end up pumping is $4 trillion, the total. But what they've done is they are going to pump in 500 billion today, another 500 billion by Friday, and then and then this is on top of the 175 billion they're already pumping in every day. So yes.
Well, we were talking about the economic effects of the coronavirus, but then also the economic effects of government's response to it. So, for example, in the US, I think it might have been the Democrats, I might be wrong if they had some cross-partisan support, but they wanted to, for example, give people, a certain amount of money every day or every week for, when they couldn't go to work, kind of thing. That has to come from somewhere, right? That can't just be, can it just be printed with no consequence?
I was about to say that the people who are proposing these things, they must think it can just be printed. I mean, if you can just, a central bank can just write a check for R1 trillion without having to seeking the approval of Congress or anything like that. The assumption there is that they can just continue printing money as much as they want. And the way they get this money to the market is by monetizing government debts, which is exactly what Zimbabwe did. And if you keep doing that, eventually you get to hyperinflation. So I'm not saying it's going to happen now, or this is the ultimate collapse, but there are a lot of worrying signs, especially in the bond market. If you look at the corporate bond market, yields have just shot up. I think they went from 3 to 6%. So those things are things to worry about, and that show you that it's not just COVID-19. There's something below the surface.
Yeah, it might just be it's exposing the cracks now.
Exactly.
And as usual with these sorts of big catastrophes and crises, governments use it as an opportunity to increase their own steps, kind of thing. We saw that in 1920 with that. Well, we didn't see it, but we've studied it and we've read about it. That when that crisis happened, they used that as a justification. The same thing in 2008. They'll use it to justify more regulation and legislation.
No, it's a worrying thing. But moving on to the last topic. Apparently, the business rescue practitioners for South African Express, the other government-owned airline that's no one talks about.
They do fly under the radar.
Yeah, they were complaining that government.
Not that they ever fly. Sorry.
Yeah, government is interfering in the business rescue process. And so I don't know. What do you think about this story, Jacques? I mean,
so basically what happened is the Department of Public Enterprises approached Ziegler SA and launched a court application that resulted in SA Express being put into business rescue through court order.
So they're a creditor.
Yeah, they are a creditor. Yes, and the DPE, the Department of Public Enterprises, approached them, asking them do not ratify this decision to appoint the specific two business rescue practitioners, which they're not allowed to do, by the way. And then when that failed, they approached Transnet and South African Airports Company, or Airports Company South Africa, AXA, which also refused. Luckily, all the independent creditors voted to ratify the decision.
Okay.
So basically, and again, what government is trying to do here is they're trying to argue that the Public Finance Management Act should prevail over the Companies Act with respect to business rescue, which is extremely unconstitutional because, for one, it undermines the courts because the business rescue practitioners are officials of the court.
Okay.
In this instance, in terms of the Companies Act, it undermines the court. It undermines public accountability.
Sure.
The irony here is the Public Finance Management Act, one of its objects is to promote accountability, but the way the government's trying to use it is to undermine accountability. And I mean, in Section 195 of the Constitution, you have principles that are set out on how public finances should be managed, etc., etc. And of those principles, you have the issue of accountability as well. So no, government is completely trying to undermine the Constitution here, as well as the principle of equality before the law. Because why should entities in business rescue be treated differently simply because they're owned by government? Why should government be given preference when it comes to business rescue, and not why should other private entities be treated differently? And the government.
I was about to ask you about that, Jacques, actually, because it seems to me the PFMA, as far as I understand, is an example of public law. It's a law aimed at governing the conduct of government itself. Whereas the Companies Act, it's law that applies to everyone. So it's law that we all have to follow.
So basically, in the Companies Act, I think it's Section 4 or 5. I'm not sure. It sets out that it specifies that if there's a conflict between provisions in the Companies Act and a closed list of certain other pieces of legislation, then those pieces of legislation should prevail. Now, one of those is, in fact, the Public Finance Management Act. So basically, this is what the Minister of Public Enterprises also argued in the case of South African Airways, is that basically what happened is, and this gets a little bit technical, so just bear with me. So basically what the minister argued was that in terms of the Companies Act, the business rescue practitioners take over the functions of the board. In terms of the Public Finance Management Act, the board of a public entity is the accounting authority. So then they argued, okay, so the business rescue practitioners are effectively the accounting authorities, and the Public Finance Management Act implies that the accounting authorities are accountable to government and not to the judiciary. So if you go purely according to the letter of the law, because the Companies Act itself states that, okay, so there's a little bit of conflict, therefore the Public Finance Management Act should prevail. But so government tried that loophole, but the thing is, we have something called the Constitution, and luckily our Constitution is actually quite good, contrary to popular belief. It's actually a brilliant Constitution, which leads to one to conclude that the conclusion by government that the PFMA should prevail over the Companies Act and render the business rescue practitioners accountable to them and not to the court would be blatantly unconstitutional. It would undermine accountability. It would undermine the Constitution itself, the rule of law, everything. And government cannot be allowed to get away with this. But the problem with SAA was, one of the business rescue practitioners said they agree with the minister's stance. So then you have the issue, well, are they really as independent as they should be? Luckily, the business rescue practitioners in the case of SA Express do seem to be standing their ground because they submitted a report to the High Court saying on 2 occasions the Department of Public Enterprises tried to undermine us. And I mean, just to put the cherry on top, they wanted to meet with the department, and their lawyers had to intervene to get a meeting with the Deputy Minister of Public Enterprises. So, I mean, the level of intervention here is quite insane and blatantly unconstitutional.
No, this is something that we need to definitely keep an eye on and see how it goes, because it's just going to set, if we allow government to do this now, it's going to set another precedent, and we still have a lot of SOEs that are in financial trouble.
No, business rescue will mean nothing if the sort of independence is compromised. So is government serious about possibly turning things around or fixing things, or are they just going to keep throwing taxpayer money that could be used for service delivery for poorer South Africans to these state-owned airlines?
And I mean, the whole point of business rescue is, okay, we get the people who screwed up in the first place out.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, some
And the
accountability.
government is trying to reverse that process. I mean, to put the people who crashed these airlines, basically crashed them into the ground, nose first, to put them in charge of the people who are now charged with trying to save the airline is absolutely insane.
It's really backward thinking.
Yeah, it's irrational. It doesn't make any sense. I think this is where we should leave it for this week. We will see you next week, dear viewers and listeners. Have a great one. And Chris, do you have the social media?
Not the specific links. Martin's always better at this than I am. But just, guys, thanks again for your support, for watching us every week. Really appreciate it. Please like this video. Please share it. Please subscribe to the channel. Just click on the big red subscribe button underneath the video. Please find us on Facebook and on Twitter, Free Market Foundation South Africa. If you guys are interested in our next upcoming event, Martin and I are presenting a talk here at the FMF on the 25th of March on the proposed sports amendment bill. If you guys are interested in that, please come and attend that event. Just register on our website, www.freemarketfoundation.com. Thanks, and we'll see you next week. Cheers.